Welcome to our webinar today about business and key biodiversity areas. My name is Bridget John and I will be your moderator. Today's webinar is hosted by the International Association for Impact Assessment, or IAIA. We are the leading global network on best practice for using impact assessment to make informed decisions. Today's presentation is part of a webinar program that we initiated last year, and I invite you to visit our website to check out the recordings of a few of our more recent webinars. The website, IAI, is located at iaia.org/webinars.php, and that'll be on screen here shortly. And some of our more recent webinars included biodiversity information for high-level biodiversity screening, information about psychosocial impact assessment, health impact assessment. We had a webinar on resettlement as well. And we encourage you to share or tweet about the webinar today if you feel so moved. Our handle is at IAIA Network, and our hashtag is IAIA Webinar. We'll be getting the screen online shortly here. We just one brief technical difficulty to show the screen. As we're preparing for that, just a few items of housekeeping for you. We will indeed be recording the webinar, and you'll be receiving a notification of that within 48 hours with a link. If you have any questions today, we have two presentations going. Andy and Giulia will be presenting, and we'll have a time at the end of each of their presentations for questions. So please enter your questions at any time in the questions section of the control panel, usually on the right side of your screen. I'll be monitoring those as we go, so enter them anytime. You can see now a few of II's webinars and our website, our Twitter handle, and our hashtag there. And finally, our last bit of housekeeping is, yes, we are making the slides available for both of our presenters today. You can find that in the control panel in the handouts section. There are 5 handouts. Both of their slide presentations are available, and there are a few, 3 other handouts related to our topic today on key biodiversity areas. Our first presenter today is Dr. Andy Plumptre. Andy is the head of the Key Biodiversity Areas Secretariat, working for a partnership of 12 of the largest conservation institutions to identify, map, and conserve the most important places on the planet for biodiversity. Before he took this post, Andy was country director for Wildlife Conservation Society's Uganda program, as well as managing a regional program in the Albertine Rift. In this role, he engaged with oil companies, civil society, and government to minimize impacts of oil exploration and production in Uganda. This included improving the training and practice of environmental impact assessments by practitioners there. Andy has promoted conservation in Africa for 30 years and has authored more than 250 publications. His presentation today will address how key biodiversity areas are identified and how to access the world database of key biodiversity areas. A little bit later, we'll have our second presenter, Giulia Carbone, Deputy Director of the Business and Biodiversity Program at IUCN. I'll introduce her in more detail before her presentation later, but just to give you an idea, she will be providing an overview of the guidelines and how they can be applied in different contexts. So now I'll turn the presentation over to Andy to get us started.
Thank you, Bridget, and welcome everyone. I'll talk for about 20 minutes and then have a little bit of time for questions at the end, so please feel free to ask any questions. I'm going to be talking about the whole KBA program, which is aiming to identify and conserve the most important sites for biodiversity conservation on Earth. Generally, when we think about conservation targets, we tend to think of species, we think of habitats and ecosystems, and we also think of ecosystem processes such as the hydrological cycle, provision of water for communities, but also other things like tourism and other ecosystem processes that are important. Generally, we've got a pretty good handle on how to identify important species for conservation. with the IUCN red list of threatened species. This is just a summary of the different criteria that are under that. But we have had a whole mixed approach to identifying where the most important sites to conserve on Earth. There's been the hotspots approach, which is sites particularly rich in biodiversity, but also threatened by man. There's been the global 200 ecoregions, which are the ecoregions which are also threatened by man, but also richest in species. The important bird areas approach has brought it down more to a site level for birds. And there's also similar things with important plant areas and the Alliance for Zero Extinction sites, amongst several other processes that have been going on. In 2004, the World Conservation Congress requested the Species Survival Commission come together and identify a method to enable countries to identify what were called key biodiversity areas. And it was drawing from data on the IUCN Red List of threatened species and other data sets. So a process started at that time, but really got going in about 2011, 2012 to identify and come up with the criteria that would identify what were called key biodiversity areas. And this is the first time the conservation community has tried to agree on a common approach for identifying the most important sites on Earth, and it involved many consultation processes at different times in order to get feedback from everyone and try and incorporate the ideas that were being used in each of the different site identification processes being used at the time. And the definition of a KBA is a site that makes a significant contribution to the global persistence of biodiversity. The different criteria and thresholds, there are 5 main criteria that are used. First one is threatened biodiversity, and this can be either threatened species using the IUCN Red List process of identifying endangered, critically endangered and vulnerable species, or the threatened ecosystem types using IUCN's red listing process for ecosystems. The second criteria looks at geographically restricted biodiversity. It can be individual geographically restricted species, co-occurring where you have 2 or more species together, and then assemblages of species, which is trying to capture some of the hotspot idea. And then similarly, geographically restricted ecosystem types or habitats. The third one is ecological integrity, which tries to capture within each ecoregion the most intact sites that occur in those ecoregions. So they contain a full suite of the species that would have existed in that sort of habitat and that have been minimally impacted by man. So some ecoregions won't have a criteria C site, but it's supposed to be the best example of that type of ecoregion. Fourth criteria is looking at biological processes, demographic aggregations such as migratory stopover sites for migrating species, environmental refugia, where there are particular sites which are important during particular times of stress, such as during droughts, where species congregate, and recruitment sources such as spawning sites for certain fish species or nesting sites of group nesting birds. And then the final criteria uses a conservation planning approach where you're looking at sites which, if you're wanting to capture your full suite of species in a region, they are selected more than 90% of the time in any conservation planning assessment. The KBA program is a partnership of 12 different organizations, and all the logos are at the top of this slide. They are represented by a KBA committee, which comes under them. And under the KBA committee is the KBA Secretariat, which I head, and the World Database of KBAs. I'm sitting in BirdLife International, but I represent all the 12 conservation partners. In addition to the KBA Secretariat, there's technical working groups that work on different issues, such as the criteria and how to provide guidelines for those criteria. There's the KBA Consultative Forum, which is aiming to bring business and government and end users together to give feedback on KBAs to the KBA program. And then there's the KBA community, which is bringing together groups that are interested in identifying KBAs around the world to learn from each other and identify best practices. There's also on the left the Standards and Appeals Committee, which is kept independent of the whole KBA committee and processes under the KBA committee so that they can adjudicate if there are any appeals against KBAs, and they act as an independent adjudicator. KBA identification process will start from either an external proposer or a national coordination group, which would be formed within a country. They would propose a KBA to a regional focal point. That regional focal point would initially give some feedback and then send it out for validation by external experts just to get some independent analysis of the proposal. They then feed it on to the KBA Secretariat, and it's validated again at that stage, and if it passes those steps, it will be put into the world database of key biodiversity areas. What we hope to do is that each country would have a national coordination group established, which would be formed of partly government, partly taxonomic experts, and partly people who have a role in conservation, so that they not only propose KBAs, but that there's a mechanism in place to monitor those KBAs and also ensure their conservation. The World Database of KBAs currently has about 15,700 KBAs already identified. As I'll show you later, most of those are for birds because it built upon the important bird areas approach. But what I would like to point out is there's already a large number of KBAs already identified. KBAs contribute to quite a few of the Sustainable Development Goals, done things like people's livelihoods, health and well-being. The two obvious ones are life below water, Sustainable Development Goal 14 and 15, contributing to conservation of life on land. Similarly, KBAs contribute also to the IAIA targets, which are the targets for the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity under the Convention for Biological Diversity. And again here, IAIA target 11 and 12, which are formation of protected areas and reducing risk of extinction, and two of the key targets that it meets. Looking at the IAIA target 11 in particular, which states that 17% of the land and 10% of the marine areas will be set aside as protected areas. One of the things that's been clearly shown in that is, although there's been the good progress has been made in actually moving towards those achievements, we're currently at about 15.5%, something like that, on the terrestrial. What hasn't happened is that those sites haven't necessarily been put in the place where they maximize the conservation of most species. So a study was done recently which showed that the number of protected areas that have been established since 2004, when we had a pretty good idea about conservation planning approaches, we've saved about an extra 87 species. Had we planned it better, we could have saved about 3,700 and something extra species. So what KBAs can do, it can help guide the rolling out of any increase in protected area coverage, and by making sure that it goes to sites which have species which aren't necessarily captured in other protected areas. If we look at the number of different taxa that have been assessed and which ones have been so the numbers that trigger KBA status at different sites, you can see that about 2/3 are triggered by birds, and as I said, that's because it builds on the IBA process, which tried to identify important bird areas around the whole world. But 1/3 has already been identified for other taxa, particularly mammals, plants, and reptiles. And there's processes ongoing at the moment to greatly expand that, so that pie for the birds will shrink with time, but as we identify important areas for other taxa over the coming years. So currently a crude estimate of the rough numbers of KBAs in each continent are given here, and you can see that they're primarily dominated by the tropics, but that a lot also exist for Europe, where a lot of IBA assessments have been made. Some of the key threats to biodiversity are probably well known by many of you, but they include mining and the impacts of mining and extractive industry, threats from logging, both artisanal logging and logging by companies, creation of hydroelectric dams and other dams that flood large areas, and large-scale agricultural plantations such as oil palm. These are some of the main threats which cause loss of habitat to species. One of the real concerns at the moment, there's major plans, particularly with plans from China to develop large parts of Africa and Asia. And what we're wanting is that key biodiversity areas are recognized in any of these planning approaches, so that ideally they're avoided, or if they can't be avoided, impacts on the species that trigger the KBA status of a site are minimized. And that's what Giulia will be talking about in her presentation. One of the things that's been set up, and I realize that you've had a presentation recently about IBAT, so I won't say too much about it, but the important thing to recognize is that key biodiversity area data feeds directly into IBAT, so that IBAT has data on the key biodiversity areas, it has data on the world's protected areas, and it has data from the IUCN Red List, all compiled in one database. And you can sign up to IBAT as a business, or as a financing institution, or for research and conservation planning purposes. And at each of those levels, you get different types of data and different types of analyses that combine all three data sets together. And in particular, what's useful in IBAT is the ability to generate specific reports that companies often want, such as a PS6 report, to be able to assess which of the potential critical habitat trigger species and critical habitats that should be assessed by a company before they move ahead in an area. So the idea is that this is a one-stop shop where the KBA data can be made available, and ideally the sites are avoided, but as I said, if work is going to go ahead, then at least look out for the critical habitat trigger species and do things to try and ensure that they're conserved. If you want to know anything more about the KBA process, we have a website, www.keybiodiversityareas.org, and I've given my email address there. You're free to contact me, and also we have a Twitter handle, KBA_info. I'll finish there and leave it open now for any questions that people have.
Great, thanks so much, Andy. And we do have some questions that have been coming in. So let's start with Iris. She's asking about the size of a KBA. How large can it be? Is there a size limit? And how are the borders determined?
So there's no particular size limit defined anywhere. The only thing is that it has to be a manageable site. So that partly depends on where the site is. So in some parts of Central Africa, for instance, the Salonga National Park is the size of Belgium and is still considered a manageable site. The criteria C sites, which are the sites based on ecological integrity, and there's a recommendation that they're about 10,000 kilometers squared, so they can be quite large sites. But for most sites that occur, I would say that they're much smaller than that, and they're mostly protected areas, or the size of protected areas, so will vary between about 50 to 300 to 400 square kilometers.
All right. Judy's asking what the process is for to identify KBAs for soils and soil microbial organisms.
So the KBA process isn't set up for bacteria and protozoa, but fungi are being considered, and there's a person on the technical working group who is trying to feed into the KBA process assessment for fungi. So although the single-celled species are not being considered, other species at other levels are being considered, and they would use exactly the same criteria. If you, for each of the criteria when you're assessing them, ideally you would use the numbers that exist for that species globally and compare what percentage you have in an area, and there are different thresholds for different criteria. But for many species you don't have that, and certainly for the smaller organisms that you generally don't have numbers. So what can be used instead is the proportion of the range or the proportion of suitable habitat or the area of occurrence as defined by the IUCN Red List. Each of the proportion of that occurs in an area can trigger KBA status.
Hilton is asking about KBAs that have been identified globally and how accurate are the numbers? For instance, how accurate are the KBA numbers for Africa?
So as I said, this is in the same way that the Red List is an ongoing process. We haven't assessed all species on Earth for their threatened status. The KBA identification is an ongoing process as well. So as I said, most of the birds have been assessed, and they form about 2/3 of the current trigger species for KBAs, but most other taxa that we haven't assessed them thoroughly at any site in any country. So at the moment, what we're trying to do is set up national coordination groups in different countries that will assess other taxonomic groups. So one of the things I would ask the people who are listening into this is, you're going to be collecting data as part of your assessments in different parts of the world. It would be really useful if you're assessing a species and there's very little known about it, if that data can be fed into the KBA database. And in the future, we hope to have the ability to set that up and allow you to do it automatically. But for now, if you can email me information about a species and I can file it and we can start building on that, it would be very useful.
Great. There are a couple of questions related to what is considered when defining a KBA. Maria is asking about whether national protected areas are taken into consideration, and Paul's asking about World Heritage sites, if those are also considered.
So initially, when you identify the KBA, you're looking at where does the species occur and what is needed. If a KBA falls within a protected area completely, then we would advise, and in the guidelines, it advises that the boundary of the protected area is given the KBA status. But what we also ask KBA proposers to do is send in a shapefile of where that species occurs within the protected area, so it's known, because that will then be feeding into IBAT and can help guide if there's any developments that happens in that protected area. It can guide where those developments occur, and ideally they try and avoid where the KBA trigger species is. If a KBA area for a species is partially in and partially outside a protected area, there are two options. One is first assess, is there enough of the species outside the protected area to form a separate KBA on the outside as well as the inside? If not, are there options to expand the boundary of the protected area? And then if it's totally outside a protected area, we do not say it has to be managed as a protected area. What we ask is that anyone working in a country is trying to manage that site so that the trigger species that's triggering KBA status for that site is protected.
Francois is asking if the North.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, you weren't.
There was the World Heritage question as well.
Ah, yes, sorry.
So, some World Heritage sites will be KBAs, that's certain, and they're probably more likely to qualify for KBA status. But again, they tend to be protected areas, and the same guidelines would apply as protected areas.
Great, sorry about that. Francois is asking if the North and the Arctic are well investigated or covered.
So they're well covered for birds, but probably not for other taxa.
Okay. We have a question asking what the specific role for oil and gas industry is in all of this, and is there a specific role for them?
So there are two things I think the oil and gas industry can help with. One of the things, they often have the resources, and they're involved in doing biodiversity assessments at sites. With currently 15,700 KBAs around the world, it's impossible for us to be monitoring all of these sites, and they're going to be more in future. And part of the way we're thinking that can happen is by setting up these national coordination groups. But it would also be useful if we can get feedback from industry, if they're working in an area and there's an area that's a KBA near them, if they're collecting data on the trigger species at that site, it would be very useful if they could also help provide that data to us. And particularly anything about the status of the site would be useful. I know quite often there are restrictions on how information can be shared, but wherever information can be shared, it would be incredibly useful to be having that sort of feedback.
All right. With the increased number of projects potentially falling within the boundaries of KBAs and leading to cumulative adverse impacts, how frequently is specific KBA info updated?
So currently the bird life, important bird areas, they have a partnership around the world which is providing inputs and providing monitoring data about the IBA KBAs, so the important bird areas that became KBAs. For other sites, there is no fixed monitoring process in place at the moment. We are in the process of developing a monitoring protocol, and we'll be encouraging sites to be updated between 8 and 12 years at a minimum. If they could be updated more quickly, that would be ideal. But we're following a similar approach to what's done with the IUCN red listing, where they aim for 5 years, but in reality it's between 5 to 10 years. So what we want to see is that updating to be happening within an 8 to 12 year period, but a lot can happen, I realize, in that time scale. And that's again where any information we can get from companies, when they're working in an area, would be useful.
All right, lots of questions coming in. We won't have a chance to get to them all, unfortunately, but we can take one more question before we change gears a bit and switch over to Giulia. Andy, what's the current status of KBAs within governmental organizations, and what are the plans for that?
So currently, under the Sustainable Development Goals, there are certain metrics that are being recorded in terms of the amount of KBAs that are covered by protected areas, and countries are being asked to report on that. In terms of, so the countries are beginning to become aware about KBAs. There are currently 5 national coordination groups which have already been established, and we've got interest from about 20 to 25 more countries at the moment. So I would see engagement of governments becoming greater in the near future.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Andy. I know we'll be hearing more from you a bit later, as I'm sure there are more questions at the very end that you'll be able to address as well. So as we shift over to Giulia's presentation, let me just introduce her for you all. Giulia Carbone is the Deputy Director of the Business and Biodiversity Program at IUCN. Her recent responsibilities include managing the Western Gray Whale Advisory Panel, developing recommendations for responsible business operations in and around KBAs, adapting the mitigation hierarchy to the sport and energy sectors, and developing the Aluminum Stewardship Initiative's performance standard. Previously, Giulia worked for the United Nations Environment Program, coordinating their tourism work. So now Giulia will share her screen and give us an overview of the guidelines and how they can be applied.
Thank you, Bridget. Can you see my screen yet?
I can, as long as you switch it to full screen presentation mode, we'll be set.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that. Yes.
Perfect.
Okay. All right. And so thank you very much to all of you. And actually, the last couple of questions were a perfect way into my presentation, which is really about defining guidelines for business that have could pose a risk on the KBA and specifically the KBA biodiversity triggers. Before I get in, I just can give you a little bit of a story of how we started this project, because it probably will give you a better understanding of the focus of this project. As in the Business and Biodiversity program, we have been involved in many standards. We have led some standards such as the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, but we are regularly invited to be a stakeholder, a member of standard setting groups and providing input to companies. And we realized that really depends who goes to these meetings, and it's difficult to have a common, there was really no common view on certain very critical questions, such as, what should be the overarching responsibility of business in certain areas? What should business do? Of course, there are a lot of resolutions coming from the IUCN membership, but apart from certain cases, they're not that specific. So we thought, well, it would be interesting to have kind of like not a gold standard in the sense of, a new standard, that a certification system, but some set of common guidelines on how, the conservation community believes business could operate in areas of high biodiversity. And while we were having these thoughts, basically the KBA standard, which is what Andy was just talking about, was coming to light and was about to be approved by IUCN, and we thought this is the perfect match, because that standard defines the areas that are important for biodiversity, and we need now guidelines to guide business on how to operate in these areas, because they're special, as we said, through the as defined by the KBA standard criteria. So we approached the Tiffany Foundation, and they generously approved this proposal, but also on the ground that we were not supposed to set a new standard and a certification system, but we were supposed to develop some language and some content that could be fed in existing certification systems and other tools. And this is what we did. It took us a couple of years, because again, we put at the table many organizations, and not only the 12 organizations that are members of the KBA partnership, but also other stakeholders from the industry. So as you can imagine, this takes time. But the product is here, and I'm now here to present it to you, and hopefully it will also be useful in your job as, if you do carry out impact assessment, if you advise companies in developing policies and so on. The target audience for these guidelines is very broad. And again, as you can imagine, this also created some problems, although it has opportunities, because it's not just about the big operations, which, for example, would be familiar with IFC performance standards and most of the time apply it, and they know by heart IFC performance standard 6. We really try to keep in mind the whole spectrum in terms of sectors, so sectors that have a high footprint, as also sectors that might actually have more a positive influence on biodiversity. And we are also trying to include new projects as well as existing operations. There are 15 guidelines, and this is the cover of the report, which is one of the documents that you can download as a support documentation that has been provided by Bridget. And for this presentation, I have grouped them in 3 categories: guidelines that support the implementation of the mitigation hierarchy, the guidelines that can support conservation efforts on the ground, and the guidelines that can support corporate accountability. For the first category, the implementation of the mitigation hierarchy, I just show you this slide, which I'm pretty sure you know by heart. But just to confirm that we are talking about the very now hopefully traditional and mainstream mitigation hierarchy, which goes from avoidance, minimize, restore, and offset, that talks about net gain, and it also has that element of additional conservation action. So this is the reference. And so the guidelines have been designed to support the implementation of the mitigation hierarchy. Therefore, assume that any business in developing new projects or in their operations will implement the mitigation hierarchy. So in terms of the guidelines and what they support, so I have somehow reorganized, and you will see the G numbers are basically the numbers of the guidelines that you can find in the report. And I'll go through them pretty quickly, but you can see in more detail what they are in the report, and I'm happy to go in more detail if you have any questions. In terms of the what, and here is really what I mean by the what, I mean like what are additional guidelines or additional recommendations in implementing the different steps, so from avoidance to offset. So, for example, priority to avoidance. In this case, this is a pretty tricky guideline because it defines the area in particular where the partners recommend projects not to take place. So it's an avoidance of project. And this one also refers to a number of IUCN resolutions and recommendations, such as, for example, the resolution 061 from the 2016 Congress that clearly calls for oil palm plantations not to be located in key biodiversity areas. And it talks about environmental damage, industrial activities and infrastructures not to be located in protected areas, and in this case, if KBAs are in protected areas, but also talks about having particular attention to impact assessment when they are in KBAs. There is also the question about loss of primary forest, which is addressed by another resolution. So the whole approach here is that there are a number of activities that would have a major impact in terms of the loss of the values, and therefore very likely the best approach would be avoidance. We will talk about avoidance such as no-go when I talk about offsets later, when I talk about G5. The other two guidelines are about minimization, which calls for try to implement minimization operations and your project starts. So to really create as much as possible resilience in the system. With regards to restoration, the guidelines recognize the challenge of restoration, and specifically of very unique ecosystems and habitats, and therefore the partners have agreed to introduce in these guidelines the concept of limits to restoration. Therefore, it's not, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of limits to biodiversity offsets, but in this case, the same limit has been applied also to restoration, understanding that the ecological success in the biodiversity outcome of restoration, as much as offsets through restoration is similar, therefore the limits should be applied also to restoration. And there are a number of other requirements that have been identified through the guidelines, and in particular is the question about making sure that there is a proof of concept before the impact starts, and therefore to make sure that the actual restoration is possible. And if it's not possible, then they have, the design phase has to go back, and they have to redesign the project to make sure that the actual restoration can be successful. Same idea in terms of limits to biodiversity offsets. So this is to say that there's not an absolute no-go to any activity other than oil palm, actually, as said in guideline 2. But as long as the impact can be restored, and as long as the impacts can be offset. And within this, there is again the reference to the limits to biodiversity offsets, which actually in the guidelines will refer to the IUCN policy, which defines the situations in which offsets are not acceptable, and therefore a project probably cannot go ahead because it will never be able to achieve no impact. And we are talking about additional limits to biodiversity offsets that have been introduced for KBAs. And one is about the project should achieve net gain on the trigger elements. The gain should be achieved before the impact occurs in general, and then there is an additional reference to the fact that if it takes a lot of time to achieve these gains, there should be clear financing in place before the impact occur. The offset cannot be used if the residual impact on biodiversity, that means as you know, the impact that are on the KBA, will lead to a site no longer meeting the KBA criteria. So in this case, we would go back to the KBA standards that Andy was talking about in the specific threshold. If the impact is so high that the actual threshold there will be, that will not be present anymore for the site to be a KBA, then in theory there is a limit to offsets. And finally, that development and as well as the offset should have obtained the free, prior, and informed consent of any impacted local community. So this is about the what. In terms of the how, the guidelines also offer a lot of interesting suggestions on how to actually implement the mitigation hierarchy, from what type of biodiversity baseline is recommended, and to the type of financing for the entire mitigation measure package and not just the offsets, how the monitoring could be designed, the responsibility in case of divestment, the participation and consultation. In this case, there is a specific reference to involving the organizations that were originally part of the identification of the KBA. And then finally, how these guidelines are implemented in terms of existing operations. Then there are a few other recommendations in terms of additional conservation actions, which is calling for the investment in these actions, even if they're not related to the offset of the impact, as well as the use of KBAs as targets for offsetting impact generated in other places, other sites that are not KBA. And finally, a call for sharing biodiversity data, which is just what Andy was mentioning in relation to oil and gas companies. But this is a call for any sector, any company that generates data is something that is really how conservation on the ground can be supported. Finally, the KBA, and specifically the data that is found on the world database on KBA, can be used in terms of reporting. Especially the GRI, we have used examples of the GRI criteria on how the KBA can be used to respond to these criteria, and then specifically to assess the compliance with certification schemes. So I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to kind of go a bit faster through the last slides, so to leave you time for questions. But just to go back and say, what are the guidelines and how can this be used? And goes back also to the origin and the project proposal. We said these are supposed to be integrated into existing certification schemes. So one of my jobs right now is to actually comment on a lot of the standards that are out for comment. So I was just reviewing the RSPO, I'm looking at responsible steel, and in all of them, I'm pushing the use of the KBA, how they could include the KBA guidelines into the actual standard, commodity-based standard, for example. They can be integrated by business in their policies. They can be used in evaluating the implementation of IEC performance standards. Remember that there is a very strong similarity in how critical habitats and KBA are defined. There is not a complete match, but often if it's a critical habitat, it will also, well, if it's not, it would probably match the criteria of a KBA. And finally, ideally, these guidelines could be used for defining permitting requirements by the regulators. In terms of an applications in environmental impact assessment, I think a number of these guidelines will help in carrying out an impact assessment, especially when you're looking at the baseline, the design of the monitoring, and the stakeholder consultation. And all these refer to a specific guidelines. I should have put the number, but baseline definition is guideline 1. Monitoring, for example, is guideline 6, and stakeholder consultation is guideline 9. And then, as well as when the impact assessment is generating the mitigation measures, again, I think these guidelines can really help define the mitigation measures. And we talked about avoidance, what the type of minimization measures, the restoration offsets, and specifically calling for a net gain as the performance target. There is not only this report, we have also created an online kind of repository of material. We have started populating it with scenarios, case studies, additional information for each of the guidelines and Q&As. But this is really a live document, which we hope to update and improve regularly. So again, based on your experience and projects, if you have any example, case study, or good practice that you want to share, this is really an opportunity for you to have sharing with your peers and for everybody to learn. Again, Andy will be the direct link to the section, and you can click on it from the slide later. And finally, how can other organizations that are not the partners, and they're not the organization that actually collect, that are supporting the KBA process directly be involved. The KBA partners have designed the governance in a way that there is a possibility for all other stakeholders to be involved, and this is through the KBA Consultative Forum. They are supposed, this forum provides input and advice to the KBA committee, but is also a two-way street. They provide advice and ideas. On the other side, the KBA partners talk to the forum to help, to get help also in the dissemination of the information. Just for you to know, right after this call, I'm going to have the call with the KBA Consultative Forum, because I'm one of the two co-chairs, and the idea is really to strengthen this body to make sure that it really supports and ensures that there is a support from all parts of society to this incredible process that is the KBA. And that's all for my presentation. So back to you, Bridget.
Thank you, Giulia. Excellent presentations, both of you. And we are indeed getting some questions. You had mentioned, Giulia, on an earlier slide about how the guidelines can be used to evaluate the implementation of IFC Performance Standard 6, and we did get a couple of questions related to PS6. Is KBA a critical habitat under PS6? Giulia?
Oh, there is the KBA. Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can now, yes.
Okay. So there is actually, we have evaluated the two. So the criteria for the key of this is actually not so much in the guidelines, but is more about the standards, which is what Andy was talking about. So there is a good level of alignment between the KBA standard and the critical habitat standard as defined by Performance Standard 6. And this matches this alignment. You can check it online on our web-based resource. Is not 100%, but there are a lot of similarities. However, I think there is also a major difference is that the KBA process is an independent process, which is is basically an identification, and there is a database. Also, the delineation is done according to a specific standard, while the critical habitat assessment is a self-assessment done by the client, which of course is often verified by a third party, but I think the process there makes a big difference. Now, what I wanted to say from the guidelines perspective is that of course Performance Standard 6 are very thorough, but in certain elements don't go so deep. I mean, I think our guidelines are a very good complement to what Performance Standards requires for critical habitats. And well, for example, there is full alignment with the requirement of NPI. So it's a net positive impact or net gain for areas that are critical habitats, and in this case would be for areas that are KBAs. The main differences, for example, would be the avoidance and the specifically limits to offsets, which are for us, for the KBA are more strongly anchored in the IUCN policy on offsets, which basically calls for a number of situations not being offsettable, and therefore the project should not be going ahead.
Okay. Well, as both you and Andy mentioned, these are guidelines rather than rules for conservation. So how then can we convince businesses to adhere to the guidelines?
That's the $1 million question. If I respond, I hope I'll get the $1 million. This is the challenge, and this is why actually very wisely our donor, like Tiffany Foundation, required in our project to also have a phase which was really dissemination. So as you know, there are different strategies. Awareness is one, and this is also part of the, one of the reasons why we're doing, a number of webinars these days. Then there is a direct, direct influence with businesses, and this is why we talk with certain businesses about, this process, and also influence, for example, that supply chain through certification systems. Well, This is how we plan to do it, and this has always been in the cards like that. It was never be supposed to be yet an additional standard. Was supposed to become the kind of a common language between at least the 12 organizations that are behind the KBA, and really start pushing it in as many ways as possible. I don't think right now we have, you know, let's say the silver bullet yet.
We have a couple questions relating to other involvement of other groups. So Ronald's asking about the role of local communities in the KBA identification, assessment, and management process, and Francois is asking about the involvement of Native people in developing these guidelines.
Yeah, I think I'll let Andy answer to that one.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. As part of the guidelines for KBA identification, there's a requirement that both in the identification of trigger species, that local knowledge is brought in if it exists, and particularly in the delineation of KBAs, that there's extensive consultation and free power informed consent when delimiting the boundaries of KBAs on the ground. So it's envisioned there'll be a two-stage process, one where you do an ecological assessment of sites that are potentially important as KBAs. They will go into the database as provisional KBAs, ecologically defined, but then there's a need to do a much more thorough assessment on the ground where you would actually define the boundaries with indigenous peoples or local communities living around the site.
All right. Sarah's asking if it's possible to give some examples of how the guidelines might be integrated to conservation efforts on the ground that are performed by businesses.
Yeah, so for example, I was just talking to a company who's very interested in developing a concept on how to use KBAs as recipient of their offsets and what would be the requirements, because of course it's all good for conservation, but there are a number of other requirements for offsets in terms of, you know, social justice and like for like, and or you know, trading up, but then at the same time making sure that there is a good distribution between, you know, that there is a fair distribution in costs and benefits. But so this would be one way, would be to how do you actually concentrate use the KBA as a way to concentrate investment, as well as, you know, the same if it's, even if they're not offsets, but there are additional, you know, what we call additional conservation action, but they could be basically philanthropic type of activities that are not connected to the measurement of the offsets and the net gain and the gains, you know, using channeling and the investments into areas that have a clear role for the global persistence of biodiversity will be really one way that, you know, businesses can help conservation on the ground. And then in addition, as we said, talking about, you know, data, which is so important, sharing this data, and I don't think we can never stop saying that and repeating that, because it's lack of data is often the biggest challenge.
Nathan's asking, how do we find out who the national focal points for the KBAs are?
So where national coordination groups are established, then we will have a chair of that national coordination group, and I can put you in touch with them. But as I said, only 5 countries have so far got their coordination groups in place, but the Secretariat's only been in place since March. Those countries are Australia, Canada, Uganda, South Africa, and where's the last one? Mine's gone blank. Kenya. Kenya's got one as well. So other countries, there's certainly interest from different organizations within, as I said, about 20 to 25 other countries. And so we plan to be setting up those national coordination groups in the near future. In the interim, there are regional focal people who have been appointed for each of the main continents, and their names and contacts will be put up on the KBA website in the near future. But if you want to contact me directly, I can put you in touch with whoever might be most relevant for you.
Great, thank you for that. Did you get support or buy-in by financial organizations like the World Bank? Who wants to field that one?
Bridget?
I was waiting for Giulia to answer that, but if not, so there are aspects.
Hear the question because okay.
Go ahead.
Did you hear the question, Giulia?
No, I didn't. You were cut off. Sorry.
Okay. So did you get support or buy-in by financial organizations such as the World Bank?
Okay, so we did get a number of organizations commenting, and the financial institutions got, I mean, depends on how you define buy-in. We actually we asked a lot, we involved many organizations in the consultation phase, and we had one major meeting and then a major online consultation, and we got loads of comments from major industry associations and from financial institutions. So I would consider that interest and participation. Buy-in it's a different, I mean, I would imagine buy-in, I would measure it more about, from a way of, they integrate this in their safeguards, but for the moment this hasn't happened yet. However, financial institutions are members of the consultative forum of the KBA, so there is definite interest from the financial institutions of using the KBA as a way to identify areas of importance for biodiversity.
And Carolina is asking, and this will be our last question, unfortunately, how can you integrate local regulation and requirements related to impact assessment within the KBA guidelines?
So the idea was to do the other way around, help regulators integrate the guidelines that we have developed into the requirements, permitting requirements, so from impact assessment to the actual licensing. So what can be, for example, how can the impact assessment be conducted, and what would be the criteria for issuing the license? So that was the idea we had in mind. So we didn't, in terms of the impact assessment that the companies would have to do, that somehow is part of the mitigation hierarchy and the general responsibility of any company. So you will not read it in the document, because the document is really, the guidelines really focus on the things that we believe should be done in addition to what is considered now should be considered general practice, conducting impact assessment, defining your impact impact mitigation measures according to the mitigation hierarchy, having a biodiversity action plans, monitoring. So these add a bit, kind of say, for example, if you're doing monitoring, you should do it this way. But we avoided repainting the entire picture, because, well, to be very honest, we did, and that was first draft, and it was so long and was so detailed that we got shut down by the majority of the stakeholders who commented and said you're rewriting everything. So we kind of kept it at the kind of level that is, these are additional measures to what you would do anyway, or you should be doing anyway.
Great. Well, thank you very much, both Andy and Giulia, for great presentations, and to all of you for participating. If you are looking for more information on KBA, you can find Andy's information there. There's a link to the KBA website, as well as IBAT, which has been referenced before and is definitely related. Also, there are some other IAIA related resources you could check out on our website. We have several publications related to biodiversity, not to KBAs specifically, but we definitely have some biodiversity related key citations, some fast tips, and some best practice principles. Also, we did have a symposium last year on, and the presentations are available online. The symposium was on mainstreaming the mitigation hierarchy and impact assessment, so you might find that interesting as well. Finally, as we talked about IBAT, our most recent webinar was conducted by representatives from IBAT on accessing and interpreting biodiversity information for high-level biodiversity screening, and you can find that on our website as well. It will be the same link where you will be able to find the recording for this webinar. So as we close, I just want to thank you again all for participating. A final thank you to our speakers. In a day or two, you will be receiving a link to the recording. You'll also be able to access the handouts at that same link, including the slides that were presented today. When you leave this webinar, you will be asked to complete a brief survey. And so we do ask that you take a few moments to do that. Your feedback is very helpful, and our presenters have some questions on there that would be helpful to them as well. So we know that your time is valuable, and we hope that you found this to be valuable to you as well. Thanks, and see you next time.
Thank you, Bridget. Thank you very much.